I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This week's guest is writer Julian Hoffman and we're talking about his book Irreplaceable. I read the book a few months back and as you might expect from reading the blurb, it's about those irreplaceable wild environments and species that we're in danger of losing. What I wasn't prepared for was just how beautifully written the book is and how moving I would find it to read about the people who are so deeply connected to the landscapes and the animals that they're battling to save, and how it would stay with me after I put it down. I wish I could give a copy to all of you because it carries a message that is so important to all of us in these times. Julian spoke to me via Skype from his house in northwestern Greece, but he assured me we shouldn't be too jealous as it can get pretty cold where he is this time of year. What are we really losing when we lose wild places?
Well, I think we lose so much with the loss of any wild place, to be honest with you. And I suppose for a start, there's the place itself with all of its compound histories and its ecologies and its intricacies. And then I guess depending on where in the world you actually live, you lose all of the wildlife that's associated with that place, whether that be water voles or redwoods or kingfishers or bluebells or lynx. And you also lose the wild itself, that extraordinarily vibratory process, that kind of surge towards life and complexity. You then lose wonder and beauty and meaning. And ultimately, of course, you lose possibility itself, all that potential for human attachments and contact and connections with a wild place in your own surroundings and all of the various meanings that then resonate out from that. I suppose you lose kind of integral facet of your life. And those wild places, because I think often we've sort of distinguished wild places largely by describing or defining them as those kind of totemic wild places. You could think, for example, of the Scottish Highlands or some of the wild coasts of Wales. But in Irreplaceable, I really made a conscious effort to write about and explore also wild places in an urban context, particularly at a time when, you know, over half of the world's population is urbanized and lives in cities. And it might be simply a small urban city meadow, or it could be an allotment patch. And, you know, something like allotments, we're losing at an unparalleled pace in the United Kingdom. There was a freedom of information request several years ago that was conducted by a campaign group who were seeking to protect and preserve their threatened allotment in Watford. And they discovered that between 2007 and 2014, only 4 of 198 applications to close allotment sites had been rejected by the Secretary of State. And all of those other 194 had been destroyed. So this loss of wild places, whatever the context might be, it's kind of, that loss just ripples outwards through our lives in an exponential manner.
One of the things that struck me when I started reading the book was that obviously because of the nature of what we're talking about, we tend to compare it to what we've lost or what we've had in the past. And yes, I did think to myself, you know, if future generations don't experience as much biodiversity or as many wild spaces as the generation previously, then does it even matter? You know, will they even know what they're missing if they've never had it?
Yeah. It's a really, really critical question, I think, this. And, you know, on a very simplistic and personal level, when I think of the wonder and joy that I've been fortunate enough to experience through contact with wild animals and whilst exploring wild places in the course of my life, I would absolutely want those opportunities for contact with the natural world to be passed on to future generations, for that sort of extraordinary enrichment of human life to be theirs as it has been for mine. But what you're also asking is a really interesting question, because it leads us on to an issue or an idea that's been called the shifting baseline syndrome. Because when I think back to my contact with the natural world, it's nothing like contact with the natural might have been a century or 2 centuries or 3 centuries ago. So those future generations, as you quite rightly point out, they might not really know what they're missing. And the shifting baseline syndrome, it was developed by a fisheries expert called Daniel Pauly. It was sort of developed in response to scientists' utter inability to estimate what pre-human population sizes of fish species were and actual physical sizes of fish themselves. They had no real way of comprehending what that was on a pre-human baseline. And that idea has now gone on to be relevant, I suppose, to a much wider set of relationships between humans and the natural world. And the American writer Julia Whitty calls it the phenomenon of forgetfulness, because by and large, our relationship with the natural world tends to unfold on a day-to-day basis. That's how our sort of contact works. And it's really, really difficult for us, except in perhaps the theoretical sense, to try and understand and gauge what past abundance might actually have been. And in the process, we then tend to normalize. We psychologically accept absence. We normalize absence because we have really no way of understanding what past presence might have been. So to kind of give you a brief example, you might be thrilled in a summer's wood in England to hear an elegant quartet of birdsong. And you might possibly remember that when you were a child, that was a chorus. But you have no real way of knowing in an experiential sense that to understand that once, long ago and well before your time, that was actually orchestral. That's what the shifting baseline syndrome is about, where we simply accept the kind of continually degraded nature of the world. And the great poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, he sort of summed it up in a beautiful but very mournful poem called Binsey Poplars that he wrote in 1879 after he'd witnessed the levelling of a beloved row of poplar trees on the banks of the Thames, not far from Oxford. He wrote a line in which he says, "Aftercomers cannot guess the beauty being." And that to me really sums up where we're at in relationship with the continual diminishment and depletion of the natural world and our experiences. So it's really important to try and register the shifting baseline syndrome as much as we can and to kind of take note of what that dwindling means.
Kind of getting down, I suppose, to the crux of the book. I was also wondering, does it matter if we lose long-standing established habitats? I mean, in what way are they irreplaceable?
I mean, any established habitat is a direct result of these kind of complex interactions between, let's say, wildlife, soil, climate, and geology, and plant life. All of these things have been melded and blended together over the period of quite a long time. And, we could talk briefly about ancient woodland because it's a very timely and topical issue at the moment, particularly in Britain, because ancient woodland is a sort of really good example of what's irreplaceable, I suppose, when these sites, these places come under threat. Now, an ancient woodland in Britain is a woodland that has been in existence since at least the year 1600, as that was kind of the time when the planting of trees, the physical planting of trees by humans, began to become popular. So any woodland that has been in existence since 1600 is of natural occurrence. It predates that time when people began kind of planting. And those connections and interactions I just mentioned, they manifest themselves even more greatly with ancient woodland, because ancient woodland was critically reliant upon human livelihood and human interactions with the forest at a time when people and communities utilized woods as working woods. They were utilized to create hogshead barrels out of wood and for coppicing and for charcoal making, all of these different woodland crafts. So working woods, which most of Britain's, or a large proportion of Britain's contemporary ancient woodlands had once been, they are the result of a process that we simply can't repeat. Every last one is unique. And in many ways, an ancient woodland, some have described them as museums in a way, but what differentiates them, in my opinion, from a museum in which there's a lot of inanimate objects that have been kind of classified and showcased, is that ancient woodlands are still very, very much these living repositories of our culture and our roots. They're still utilized, if not for woodland crafts as they were in the past, very much for people's enjoyment and engagement and bird watching and walking and jogging and all these kind of things that people love to do in woodlands. And so they really are irreplaceable in the sense that we have no knowledge of how to reconstruct, how to recreate an ancient woodland, because its history was absolutely of a time, and those processes simply aren't part of our world anymore.
Yeah, and that was an interesting thing, actually, that struck me reading the book. Specifically, you write about the Hoo Peninsula with a rich landscape of saline lagoons, but they came about because of human changes. So part of me kind of wondered, who's to say that the changes we make to the landscape today won't also contribute to positive developments in the future?
Yes, yeah. And, I live in northern Greece these days, and I have done for quite a while. And, I sort of witness on a yearly, seasonal basis how human influence on the land doesn't necessarily have to be negative. And so the valley behind the house where I'm speaking to you from right now, in a couple of months or 6 weeks probably, the nightingales will return, and they return in large numbers. And one of the reasons they return in large numbers is because there are still people here who utilize the valley for the non-intensive grazing of sheep and goats and a handful of cows. And what that grazing does is it creates these little open pockets amidst willow and hazel hedges and cornelian cherry, all that lines the riverbanks, and scrub and blackthorn here and there. So you've got these little open patches and meadows and glades amid scrub, and it creates this absolutely fantastic sort of mosaic habitat, which is absolutely ideal for nightingales, and it's absolutely ideal for a profusion of butterflies and a number of other species. So the human influence on the land, on our landscapes, doesn't necessarily have to be negative, but we've reached a stage in human evolution where our capacity for transforming a landscape is simply unparalleled. And you mentioned the Hoo Peninsula, and those saline lagoons were the result of 19th century clay digging, so a relatively small scale industry. And even at the time, there's early photographs that show swans using these quarries where water sort of filled in places. But the proposal to build Europe's largest airport on the Hoo Peninsula, the story of which I tell in the book, and the story of resistance to that proposal, would have completely obliterated a large portion of the Hoo Peninsula, including two entire ancient villages in the 12th century churches. And you think of other landscapes, you look at the ruinous tar sands of Alberta, or you look at mountaintop removal in the United States, as examples of how our capacity for transformation is now really, really different to those industries that we had in the 19th and 18th.
Definitely, it's the rate of change. So that brings me on really nicely to another question, which is, how do we reconcile our desire to protect wild spaces with our need to expand and be better and faster and richer and all the rest of it?
Yeah, it's a really good, what I would say, I think one of the first things we have to do is to examine a single word in that sentence, and that's the word need. Do we need to be continually expanding? Do we need things to be faster? Do we need to be richer? Or is it about desire? And I think that, many of the people, and I say this actually as someone who, makes great use and takes joy in a lot of our digital and technological advancements, but I've also become increasingly aware of the kind of cost that has for the natural world. And many of the people I spent time with in writing Irreplaceable, they were arguing for a very, very different measure of well-being. And these were people who'd come from all different kinds of backgrounds and different parts of the world, really different parts of the world. But they were arguing for a measure of well-being that was very different to that of economic growth and GDP, which for far too long have been our kind of sole understanding of what prosperity means, at the exclusion of sort of mental well-being, emotional well-being, spiritual well-being, and the well-being of the wider world. So I think we have to begin looking at things in a much more holistic manner and recognizing that our place on this shared planet is absolutely bound up with a healthy and functioning set of ecosystems that inevitably keep us alive and well also.
And thinking about a desire to want to get somewhere quicker, and also the fact that you touched on ancient woodlands. Obviously, HS2 has got the go-ahead in the UK, and that does pose a threat to ancient woodlands. But one of the counter-arguments to the disruption that it will cause is that they will be engaging in biodiversity offsetting. So isn't it better to replace an old wood with a new wood, say, that's double the size?
I think that the writer George Monbiot probably summed up that issue. He summed it up really, really well, because he wrote in an article of his that accept the principle of biodiversity offsetting and you accept the idea that place means nothing, that nowhere is to be valued in its own right anymore, and that everything is exchangeable for everything else. And for a start, those ancient woodlands we were talking about, not only, as we briefly mentioned, they're the result of these hundreds and hundreds of, intricate interactions between people and livelihood and community and wildlife. But they exist as an ecosystem that a new wood simply can't furnish the same opportunities with. So to replace them with saplings, for example, the stag beetle and 650 other beetle species in the UK alone are absolutely dependent on ancient woodland and or old trees in some point of their life cycle. And so if you think of replacing an ancient woodland, that largely intact sort of soil structure that has been in existence for several centuries with a group of newly planted saplings, there's no real comparison, because for all those beetle species, those saplings are of no use. For woodpeckers and nuthatches, those saplings are of no use. For wildflowers like bluebells that have long had a close association with ancient woodland, those saplings are of no use. Now, maybe in, let's say, 400 years, because that's the kind of time limit we've given for ancient woodland, those saplings might accrue enough meaning to be considered to be ancient woodland. But by simply doubling the number of trees and losing the old ones in the process, we're basically replacing something of value with something of much less value.
Obviously, it would be hugely detrimental to the species, the non-human species that live in ancient woodland, for example. But I think your book is so powerful because of the people who are in it, and they were also passionate about their local environments, and they obviously had a really strong connection to the place. But I got the impression that even those who you spoke to who weren't particularly connected to the place, nobody seemed anti-nature. So my question is, from that, why can't we fight councils or policymakers or governments who do seem hell-bent on developing at any cost?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one of the biggest surprises. I spent about six and a half years traveling extensively and speaking to a large number of people and interviewing them in many different parts of the world. Was beginning to understand just how many people have a really deep connection with the natural world on some level. For some people, it was really, really active about being out and understanding species and, making sure that they were minimizing their carbon footprint wherever possible. But for others, it might have simply been about taking a stroll through a wood because it made them feel better, or for longing for kind of clean water and clean air for the children to grow up in. But they all stemmed from this same kind of idea, really, that they were really in favor of preserving the natural world. And I think that the reason that it's often so difficult, and as you mentioned, fighting councils and policymakers and governments and developers, is because at its most basic level, our economic system and its supporting political framework is heavily invested in the ruination of the living world. There is an awful lot of money to be made when you're in the business of building motorways and airports and luxury flats, or in the extractive mining industries. And capitalism has become the kind of tool through which a minority of people have kind of accrued not only vast sums of money, but also incredible power, and by and large dictate the projects that are unrolled across countries like Britain today. And so I think that it's about upsetting these relationships of power and making it clear to those whose voices typically are heard, the politicians, the big corporations, the banks, that these places, the natural world, is of enormous importance to us as individuals, as communities, and to make it clear that this matters, that this is a really, really important issue.
Yeah, this might be kind of beyond your remit, but I'm on social media, I'm on places like Twitter, and it does become a bit of an echo chamber, and you tend to follow people with similar ideals as yours, and so everybody gets aerated when some trees have been cut down or something's been trimmed out of season. But what actually can individuals do to make a difference? Because I'm not sure just kind of jumping up and down and getting upset on social media is really cutting it.
Yeah. It's I've kind of noticed this in my own use of social media, particularly in the last year or two. That kind of discussing, let's say, on social media can be of great importance, but I think there is so much that we as individuals can do. And in the book, I use this sort of metaphor of the starling murmuration, where these great sort of spectral apparitions in the evening winter skies of thousands and thousands of birds, at the heart of each and every one of these extraordinary potent masses is really just a set of single starlings. That's all a murmuration is. And I bring that back to how we can influence and make change kind of possible and to the betterment of the world. And that kind of change can mean anything from sowing wildflowers in your garden and letting your grasses and dandelions grow long. It can mean cutting holes in your fence to enable hedgehogs to move more easily through, a variety of different gardens and habitats. It can mean volunteering with wildlife and environmental organizations. It can mean lobbying politicians or voting for parties whose policies are sympathetic to the natural world and all that we stand to lose. It can mean joining Extinction Rebellion if that's your wish in any capacity that you feel you can, or to support the climate striking students across the world that have been sort of galvanized and inspired by young people such as Greta Thunberg. There's a great deal we can do, and I think that one of the key things that I learned in the writing of this book is that what I call this radical hopefulness is really about action. It's really about turning that verb hope from being a passive verb to being an active verb, and to recognizing our own agency, both individually, but also really importantly, collectively, because I can see how change is possible, and really transformative change. And over the course of writing this, I witnessed so much that was made possible simply through ordinary people standing up and making their voices heard, often in cohesion or conjunction with others. And so many of the stories that I thought would end very negatively, actually, to my great surprise, turned out very differently, precisely because of the actions that people were taking.
Yeah, and I think it's important as well, because once somebody starts doing something, even in a neighbourhood, and somebody else sees it, it kind of helps shift that idea of what is beautiful or what is unsightly. And that brings me on to your chapter, which was about the Konza Prairie, which Dickens described Prairie as oppressive in its barren monotony. And that kind of poses the question of how can people learn to love landscapes that may not be so easily read, or where their beauty is not quite as apparent? Yeah.
It was really interesting because, Charles Dickens is, I'm a great admirer of his works, and he's quoted in the first chapter of the book because he had a strong connection to the Hoop Peninsula on the edge of the Thames estuary. But I do go back to his words a bit later in the book, as you rightly point out, on the prairie, because he couldn't stand the prairie. He visited the prairies of Illinois in the middle of the 19th century and just loathed them. But I fell madly in love with the prairies. And what I realized is that those landscapes that don't have let's say, a natural aesthetic for us to attach ourselves to, whether it be, the towering spires of mountains or great, flushes of trees rising up, or great gorges and lakes. We have to think about our relationship differently. And I would personally advocate trying to approach it with almost a childlike curiosity, because you look at how children approach the natural world, very young children, they're can be fantastically absorbed in the very smallest of things. They just let themselves almost sink into any kind of scrubby little meadow that we as adults might kind of pass by. And so on the prairie, for example, feel the wind, watch how the sun kind of settles and stirs and shifts through the clouds across these great swaying, rolling, dipping hills of grass. Listen to the bluebirds and to the, these different species, and to kind of let yourself just sort of slowly settle into that great sea of grass. There are all of these more minor processes, let's say, that are continually unfolding anywhere that we experience in our lives. And, there was a really interesting example in Leeds the other day that you may or may not have seen on Twitter, where a group cleared out what had been Buddleia scrub and various other species, and because they thought that it cleaned this kind of verge. But what was revealed was a rather ugly sort of iron or metal fencing against some brickwork and a lot of graffiti. And of course, what was lost from that scrub come spring was the profusion of flowers that butterflies and other bugs would have been immediately attracted to. And I think we do need this shift in our kind of aesthetic understanding of what is important and meaningful, because what's pretty to us might not necessarily be what's useful to the wider world that we depend on.
Yes, I did see that. And actually, that's what I had in mind when I asked the question about, how do we shift people's views of what is unsightly? Because actually a surprising amount of people came forward and said, that was lovely. That was, and although it might have just looked like a patch of scrub, a lot of people defended it. So that I found quite heartening, really.
It was.
Yeah.
It was. You're absolutely right.
And I suppose the other question I was going to ask, your book is called Irreplaceable, and when I read it, I did panic because there's such a lot at stake and there's so many things we can lose. But you also touch on the idea of not just preservation, but restoration. And a lot of people who I speak to who come out against, kind of maybe things like the native plant movement or trying to keep habitats as they are, will accuse me or will accuse the kind of idea of that of being just an exercise in nostalgia. But I thought it was really interesting when you spoke about restoration, because I wondered how meaningful it actually can be to re-establish something that has been wiped out from a site and that can only be restored with human intervention. And I was thinking specifically about your chapter on Medewin.
You're right. Preservation and restoration are two very different things. But I think particularly in the midst of a climate and biodiversity crisis, we need to be not only preserving what we already have, not only retaining what remains with us, but also expanding outwards from those places and to be looking to restoring some functional processes in the ecosystem. So restoration can never truly replace what was lost. For the very simple reason that the kind of essence and meanings of the places are bound up with its histories and all of those processes that brought it into being in the first place. But I see restoration as an extraordinarily powerful and potent method of healing effectively damaged land. It's about sort of making good on old debts. And Medewin Prairie in Illinois was a really inspiring example that I was fortunate enough to spend some time on. And even the name itself, which was chosen, because the name effectively refers to the sort of great medicine society of the Anishinaabe peoples who once inhabited this area. So it was about the healing people, because this was really about healing the land itself. Because even though Illinois has a colloquial name, which is the Prairie State, there is 0.01% of prairie now remain in Illinois. The rest is gone. The rest has been gone since the middle of the 19th century, when it was plowed under by settlers to create fields for farming. But what was really fascinating about Medewan Prairie is it had a very different history from that of its surrounding fields for farming, because it had been an enormous arsenal for the U.S. Army, where armaments for the Second World War, for the Korean War, for the Vietnam War were all produced, and thousands of workers trolled away missiles and armaments and guns and, bullets. And what was left in its wake was contaminated ground, was ruined ground. And through the work of environmental organizations such as the Wetlands Initiative of Chicago and the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation, and countless volunteers, they had remade it into prairie. They had gone back, they'd stripped away the contaminated soil, and they'd allowed these processes to come into being once again. And you go there today, and work is still ongoing, but meadowlarks sing from these great stands of big blue stem. And, the bison, which was exterminated from Illinois in the 19th century, now roams the prairie once more. And restoration then, for me, is about making amends. And there was a man who showed me around called Arthur Pearson, and I think he probably summed it up probably perfectly, because he said, not only is the land restored, but something in us is restored too. And I think that's really important, because it's about reconnecting to land. It's about not only enabling species to flourish in a wider, more connected landscapes, but ideally it's about us remaking those connections with the wider world to ensure their vitality into the future alongside us.
As I said, I would love to send you all a copy of the book, but until I work out a way to make millions from podcasting, you'll just have to get your own copy. The paperback version of the book is out on the 9th of April if you'd like to wait until then. If you want to find out more about Julian, you can of course find links to his website and social media in the show notes. So a really big thank you to Julian for taking part in the interview, and thanks to you for listening, and I'll catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.